Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. A golden rule meant to guide our actions with kindness and respect. But in the shocking tale of bank manager refuses to serve black man, unaware he owns the bank, these words become a biting irony in a story of prejudice, power, and poetic justice. This is a story where a place meant for financial empowerment becomes the stage for a display of blatant racism. It is a tale of a man's unchecked arrogance colliding with an unexpected twist, revealing the true meaning of humility and justice. What blinded a manager to the truth of the man standing before him? How could such behavior persist in a world where equality should reign? And what lesson does he learn when the tables turn in the most unimaginable way? Welcome to Silicon Scribes. Prepare to be outraged, inspired, and captivated by a story that shines a light on the consequences of prejudice and the power of standing tall in the face of injustice. Do not forget to subscribe to Silicon Scribes for more real-life stories that challenge and inspire. And if you are ready to witness a moment of justice served cold, join us as we uncover the remarkable events of Bank Manager Refuses to Serve, Black Man Unaware He Owns the Bank. On a crisp Tuesday morning, 5th of March 2024, at exactly 9:15 a.m., the bustling city of Greensboro was already alive with activity. Inside the sleek, modern interior of First National Bank, a scene unfolded that would leave everyone present stunned. David Armstrong, the proud new owner of the very bank, stood in line like any other customer, his sharp suit and confident demeanor catching a few glances. As he approached the counter, the bank manager, Mr. James Bradford, looked him up and down, his expression turning cold. "I am sorry, sir," Bradford said sharply, folding his arms. "We do not cater to your kind here." David froze. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Murmurs rippled through the line of customers as people exchanged shocked glances. Bradford, still unaware of David's true identity, turned away dismissively, leaving the black man standing there in disbelief. What happened next would change everything. David smiled faintly, though his heart was pounding. He leaned forward, his voice calm yet firm. "Do you know who you are speaking to?" The bank manager frowned but did not answer. "Let us just say you might want to rethink your words," David added with a slight smirk. Bradford's face contorted with confusion and defiance. But before David could say more, a security guard began walking toward him. It all began 2 months earlier when David, a 42-year-old businessman with a passion for uplifting his community, had purchased First National Bank as part of his growing financial empire. David had worked hard to achieve his success, starting from humble beginnings in his hometown of Raleigh. Raised by his grandmother, he had learned the value of perseverance and kindness, values he carried into adulthood. His decision to acquire the bank stemmed from years of witnessing discriminatory practices within the financial system. For David, owning a bank was more than a business venture. It was a statement. "Everyone deserves respect and access," he had told his best friend Marcus the day the deal closed. But David had chosen to keep his ownership under wraps for the first few months, preferring to observe how the bank was run. He wanted to experience what everyday customers went through, especially those who looked like him. That morning, David had entered the bank, intending to make a routine inquiry about a loan program. He was dressed in his usual polished style, a gray tailored suit with a deep blue tie, yet he noticed the subtle stares and hushed conversations as soon as he stepped in. He had expected some form of bias, but not outright refusal. The bank manager, James Bradford, was a middle-aged man with a reputation for being stern. Although his years in banking had earned him respect, whispers of his prejudices often circulated among staff and customers. Bradford's expression when David approached the counter was enough to confirm those rumors. As David tried to explain his request, Bradford interrupted him mid-sentence. His tone was curt, his words laced with disdain. "You people always want something for nothing," he said, loud enough for others to hear. A few gasps escaped from nearby customers, but no one stepped forward. David's initial shock turned into quiet determination. He decided he would not let Bradford's actions go unchecked, but he wanted to handle the situation strategically. Keeping his composure, David asked to speak with the bank's regional director. Bradford scoffed. "You do not get to make demands here," he sneered. Just as Bradford motioned for security to escort David out, the bank's regional director, Ms. Clara Evans, walked in. Spotting David, she beamed and hurried over. "Mr. Armstrong," Clara exclaimed warmly, extending her hand. "What brings you here today?" Bradford's smug expression faltered. David's gaze locked on Bradford. "Oh, I was just about to introduce myself properly," he said, his voice tinged with irony. Clara's confused glance darted between the two men, sensing the tension. Before David could reveal his true identity, the sound of raised voices interrupted the moment. Across the lobby, a commotion broke out as another customer confronted a teller over an unrelated issue. The distraction provided a brief pause, but it did nothing to diminish the weight of what had just occurred. David turned back to Bradford, his calm facade hiding a storm of emotions. "This is far from over," he said firmly, his words heavy with promise. The air inside First National Bank grew thick with tension. Customers shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves while David Armstrong stood his ground. James Bradford's smug expression had faded, replaced by an uneasy frown. Clara Evans, the regional director, was now visibly confused. "Mr. Armstrong, is there a problem?" Clara asked cautiously, glancing between David and the bank manager. David gave a faint smile, his tone calm but deliberate. "You could say that," he replied. "It seems Mr. Bradford has decided I am not worthy of being served in my own bank." The room fell silent. Bradford's jaw dropped, his face going pale. "What?" he sputtered, his eyes wide. "Your own bank?" Clara repeated, stunned. David turned his gaze back to Bradford. "Yes, you heard me. I am the owner of this establishment," he said, his voice firm yet restrained. "And it seems your manager here has made quite the impression on me today." Bradford took a shaky step back. "This must be some kind of joke," he stammered, his voice trembling. "You cannot possibly—" "Enough," David interrupted, his voice cutting through Bradford's protests. "Miss Evans can confirm everything." Clara's face lit up with sudden recognition. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "It is true. Mr. Armstrong is the new owner. The papers were finalized 2 months ago." Gasps rippled through the room. The customers who had been watching in silence now stared at Bradford with disbelief and disgust. The once confident manager looked as though the floor might swallow him whole. David stepped closer, his eyes locked on Bradford's. "Now tell me, Mr. Bradford," he said slowly, "would you like to explain why you refused to serve me?" Just 3 years earlier, David Armstrong had been sitting in his small home office, surrounded by piles of paperwork. His business ventures were growing, but the challenges of being a black entrepreneur were never far away. Loan approvals were harder to come by, and partnerships often came with strings attached. Despite it all, David persevered. He had built his first company from scratch, a tech startup that focused on financial solutions for small businesses. Within 5 years, the company was a success, allowing David to expand into other ventures. But his dream of owning a bank came from a deeper place, a desire to challenge the systemic racism he had faced throughout his life. David remembered vividly the day he was denied a loan for his startup. The bank manager at the time had made a comment that stuck with him. "People like you should stick to small goals." That moment became the fuel for his ambition. When the opportunity to purchase First National Bank arose, David did not hesitate. He saw it as more than just a business move. It was a chance to create change from the inside. But David had always been a man of humility. Instead of flaunting his ownership, he chose to observe quietly, understanding the dynamics of the bank before making any major changes. What he did not expect was to encounter blatant discrimination under his own roof. Back in the present, Bradford was now visibly shaking. "Mr. Armstrong, the second had no idea," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "That much is clear," David replied coldly. "But ignorance does not excuse your actions," Clara stepped in, her tone firm. "Mr. Bradford, this is unacceptable behavior. Our bank has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination." Bradford opened his mouth to protest, but David raised a hand. "Save it," he said. "Your actions speak louder than any excuses you could make." The room watched in stunned silence as David turned to Clara. "Miss Evans, I want this matter addressed immediately," he said, "and I will personally be reviewing the bank's policies to ensure this never happens again." Clara nodded quickly, her respect for David evident. "Absolutely, Mr. Armstrong. Consider it done." As security escorted Bradford out of the lobby, the manager's head hung low. Customers began to clap, their cheers of support echoing through the room. David felt a surge of emotion but remained composed, knowing this was just the beginning of a larger journey. David turned back to the counter and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This bank will stand for equality and respect," he declared. "No one will ever be turned away because of the color of their skin." A young boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "He is like a real-life hero." David smiled at the child before addressing Clara once more. "Let us move forward, Ms. E. Vans," he said. "We have a lot of work to do." But just as the dust began to settle, an urgent phone call came in. Clara's face turned pale as she listened to the voice on the other end. She hung up and looked at David, her expression tense. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "you might want to see this." David frowned. "What is it?" he asked. Clara hesitated before answering. "There is someone outside demanding to speak with you. He says he has information about Mr. Bradford, and it is serious." David's heart skipped a beat. David Armstrong followed Clara Evans out of the bank lobby, his mind racing with questions. What could someone possibly have to say about James Bradford that was serious? The disgraced manager's behavior had already spoken volumes, but now it seemed there was more to uncover. As they stepped outside, a middle-aged man stood waiting near the entrance. He was dressed in a slightly worn jacket, his eyes scanning the crowd nervously. The man spotted David and Clara, his expression tense but determined. "Are you Mr. Armstrong?" he asked, his voice tinged with urgency. "I am," David replied, keeping his tone steady. "And you are?" "My name is Paul Watkins," the man said, extending a hand. "I used to work at this bank until James Bradford got me fired." David narrowed his eyes. "Fired? Why?" Paul hesitated, glancing around as if ensuring no one was eavesdropping. "It is a long story," he began. "But let us just say, Mr. Bradford has been running some questionable practices here for years. I tried to call him out on it, and next thing I knew, I was out of a job." David exchanged a look with Clara, who seemed equally shocked. "What kind of practices?" David pressed. Paul leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Discrimination, for starters. Bradford has a pattern of denying loans to certain groups, primarily black and minority customers, even when they meet all the requirements. And that is just the tip of the iceberg." "What else?" David asked, his jaw tightening. "There is more," Paul said grimly. "Fraud, embezzlement, cover-ups. I have proof, but no one would listen to me when I tried to report it. The higher-ups brushed it under the rug." David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. If what Paul was saying was true, this was far bigger than one man's prejudice. Clara spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. "If this is true, it could ruin the bank's reputation. Mr. Armstrong, we need to act fast." David nodded. his mind already racing through possible steps. "Paul, do you have the proof with you?" Paul held up a flash drive. "Everything is on here: emails, transaction records, customer complaints. I have been holding on to it, waiting for the right person to come along. Someone who could actually do something about it." David reached for the drive, his gaze steady. "You did the right thing coming to me," he said. "We will get to the bottom of this." Back inside the bank, David called an emergency meeting with Clara and the bank's legal team. They reviewed the files on the flash drive, and the evidence was damning. Over the past 5 years, Bradford had funneled money from customer accounts into a private slush fund. He had also manipulated loan applications, marking eligible customers as high risk to deny them access. "This is worse than I imagined," David muttered, leaning back in his chair. Clara looked visibly shaken. How did he get away with this for so long? He had help, Paul said, who had joined the meeting. Some of the staff knew about it but were too scared to speak up, and the ones who did, like me, were silenced. David's resolve hardened. "Not anymore," he said firmly. "We are going to make this right. Clara, I want every customer affected by Bradford's actions to be identified and compensated, and I want this information sent to the authorities immediately." Clara nodded. "Consider it done, Mr. Armstrong." But just as they began to organize the next steps, an urgent knock came at the door. A junior staff member poked his head in, his face pale. "Mr. Armstrong, you need to see this," he said. David frowned. "What now?" The staff member hesitated. "It is Mr. Bradford. He is outside, and he is causing a scene." David and Clara hurried back to the lobby, where a commotion had broken out. James Bradford stood near the entrance, flanked by 2 lawyers. His face was red with anger as he shouted at the security guards who had been blocking his entry. "This is outrageous," Bradford bellowed. "I demand to speak with whoever is in charge." David stepped forward, his expression calm but authoritative. "That would be me," he said. Bradford's eyes narrowed. "Armstrong," he spat. "You think you can just waltz in here and take everything I built? You have no idea who you are messing with." "I think I have a pretty good idea," David replied evenly. "And if you came here to threaten me, you should know that your little empire of lies is already crumbling." Bradford's lawyers whispered something in his ear, but he ignored them. "You do not scare me," he hissed. "This is not over." David crossed his arms. "You are right," he said. "It is not over. But the next move is mine." Just as the words left his mouth, the doors burst open, and a team of uniformed officers entered the bank. Their leader stepped forward, holding up a badge. "Mr. Bradford," the officer announced, "you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and multiple counts of discrimination." The room erupted in gasps as the officers moved to handcuff Bradford. But before they could, Bradford lunged toward David, his face twisted with rage. James Bradford lunged at David with surprising speed, his face a mask of fury. The bank lobby erupted into chaos as customers and staff scrambled to get out of the way. 2 officers immediately moved to restrain Bradford, grabbing his arms and forcing him back. "Get your hands off me!" Bradford roared, struggling against their grip. "This is my bank. You cannot do this to me." David stood firm, watching the scene unfold with a calm exterior that belied the storm brewing inside him. He refused to let Bradford's antics rattle him. "This is not your bank anymore," David said, his voice steady. "And soon, the whole world will know what you have done." Bradford's eyes burned with hatred. "You think you are some kind of hero? You are nothing but Enough!" the lead officer barked, cutting Bradford off. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." As the officers began to read Bradford his rights, Clara stepped up beside David, her face pale but resolute. "That was intense," she murmured. "It is not over yet," David replied quietly. "This is just the beginning. Later that evening, David sat in his office, going over the events of the day. Bradford's arrest was a significant victory, but it left behind a mess that would take time to clean up. The files Paul Watkins had provided painted a grim picture of the bank's internal culture, one that David was determined to change. Clara knocked on the door before stepping in. "The legal team is handling the media inquiries," she reported, "and the customers affected by Bradford's actions are being contacted. So far, most of them seem relieved that justice is finally being served." David nodded, grateful for Clara's efficiency. "Good work," he said. "What about the staff? How are they holding up?" Clara hesitated. "It is a mixed bag," she admitted. "Some are relieved to see Bradford gone, but others are worried about what this means for their jobs." "Oh, there is a lot of fear and uncertainty right now," David sighed. "I will address them tomorrow," he said. "They need to hear from me directly." Clara nodded. "I think that would help. People need to know they can trust you." David leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to Paul Watkins. The man had risked everything to bring the truth to light. David knew he owed him a debt of gratitude and perhaps a chance to rebuild his career. "Clara," David said suddenly, "reach out to Paul. I want him to come back to the bank as a consultant. His insight could be invaluable as we work to rebuild." Clara smiled faintly. "I will make the call." The next morning, David stood in front of the bank staff, addressing them in the conference room. "I know this has been a difficult time for all of you," he began. "The actions of one man have cast a shadow over this institution, and for that, I am truly sorry. But I want you to know that things are going to change." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This bank was built on the promise of serving our community with honesty and integrity. We lost sight of that, but today we begin the process of making things right. Together we will rebuild trust both within these walls and with the people we serve." The room erupted into applause, a wave of hope washing over the staff. David felt a surge of determination. He would not let them down. As the day went on, the bank began to return to a semblance of normalcy. But just as David was beginning to think the worst was behind them, Clara rushed into his office, her face pale. "David," she said, her voice shaking. "We have a problem." "What is it?" he asked, his stomach tightening. Clara held up her phone. "A video of Bradford's arrest has gone viral," she said, "and people are digging into the bank's past. There are allegations coming out. Some of them are bad." David felt the weight of her words hit him like a ton of brick. "Case, how bad?" Clara hesitated, her eyes filled with worry. "Enough to threaten everything we are trying to fix," she said softly. Before David could respond, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen. It was the bank's board of directors. David took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was coming next. David sat at his desk, his heart racing as he picked up the phone. On the other end, the chairman of the board, Jonathan Steele, spoke with urgency. "David, we need to talk," Steele said. "The video of Bradford's arrest is causing a PR nightmare. Social media is in an uproar, and news outlets are demanding a statement. Some of the allegations being uncovered are deeply troubling." David took a steadying breath. "I expected backlash, Jonathan. Cleaning up years of corruption was never going to be easy." "This goes beyond Bradford," Steele replied. "Reports are emerging about discriminatory lending practices, unfair dismissals, and hostile treatment of employees, all predating your ownership. If we do not get ahead of this, the bank's reputation could be irreparably damaged." David clenched his jaw. "Let me handle this. I will address the public directly and outline our commitment to change." "You had better move fast," Steele warned. "Some shareholders are already talking about pulling out." After the call, David immediately assembled a crisis team, including Clara and the bank's PR specialists. In a tense meeting, they brainstormed strategies to address the growing firestorm. "We need to acknowledge the past mistakes," Clara suggested. "Transparency is key. If we try to downplay or deny the allegations, it will only make things worse." David nodded. "I agree. But we cannot just apologize. We need to show concrete steps we are taking to rebuild trust." One of the PR specialists chimed in. "We could announce an independent audit of the bank's practices and invite respected civil rights organizations to oversee the process." "Do it," David said without hesitation, "and schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. I want to speak directly to the public." The next morning, David stood behind a podium in front of a packed press room, cameras flashing as he prepared to address the nation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I stand before you today as the owner of this bank, but also as a man who has witnessed the harm caused by systems of inequality and injustice. The actions of my predecessor, James Bradford, were not just wrong, they were reprehensible. And for that, I apologize to everyone who has been affected." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But an apology is not enough. That is why I am committing to a full investigation of the bank's past practices. We will work with independent auditors and community leaders to identify and address every instance of wrongdoing. And we will ensure that this institution becomes a place where everyone is treated with fairness and dignity." The room buzzed with murmurs as David continued, laying out his vision for the bank's transformation. After the press conference, David returned to his office, exhausted but hopeful. Clara entered holding a stack of reports. "You were brilliant out there," she said. "The public response has been overwhelmingly positive so far, but we still have a long way to go." David glanced at the reports. "What are these?" "Letters from customers," Clara replied. "Some are sharing stories of discrimination they faced under Bradford's leadership. Others are expressing support for the changes you are making. It is a mixed bag, but one thing is clear: people are paying attention." David felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Then we need to keep moving forward," he said. But just as they began to strategize their next steps, Paul Watkins burst into the room, his foe. "See pale, David," he said urgently. "You need to see this." He placed a tablet on the desk, playing a video that had surfaced online. It showed a group of former employees, including Bradford's close associates, accusing the bank of a massive cover-up involving missing funds and fraudulent activities. David's stomach dropped. This was worse than he had imagined. "How credible is this?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Paul looked grim. "Very. And if this gains traction, it could bring the entire bank down." David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew the stakes had just been raised to a whole new level. David felt the weight of the video pressing down on him. Fraudulent activities, missing funds. These allegations were explosive, and if they were true, they could destroy the bank. He turned to Paul. "Get me everything we have on these claims. If there is any truth to them, I need to know now." Paul nodded and left the room. Clara stayed behind, her face pale. "David, this could sink us. Even if we survive the public backlash, the regulators will come after us." David clenched his fists. "I will not let this bank go down because of James Bradford and his cronies. We will fight this head on." Hours later, Paul returned with a thick folder of documents. "This is what I found," he said, spreading the papers across the desk. "The missing funds go back almost 10 years. Bradford and his inner circle were funneling money into offshore accounts. They covered it up by manipulating the bank's records." David's stomach turned. "How much money are we talking about?" "Nearly $50 million, Paul said grimly. Clara gasped. "This is a nightmare." David nodded. "It is worse than that." If regulators find out about this before we come clean, they could shut us down permanently. We need to act fast. The next morning, David held an emergency meeting with the bank's legal team and board of directors. "We are in a crisis," he began, laying out the evidence Paul had uncovered. "But this is not the time for panic. It is the time for action. We need to notify the authorities and cooperate fully with their investigation. Transparency is our only chance at survival." Jonathan Steele, the chairman of the board, frowned. "Do you realize what you are suggesting? Admitting to this could destroy investor confidence. The stock will plummet." David met his gaze firmly. "If we do not come forward, the fallout will be much worse. This is about doing what is right, not just what is convenient." After a tense debate, the board reluctantly agreed. Later that day, David held another press conference. The mood in the room was tense as reporters waited for him to speak. "Yesterday, troubling allegations were brought to my attention," David began. "After conducting a thorough internal review, we have uncovered evidence of financial misconduct within this bank, dating back several years. Let me be clear, this behavior is unacceptable, and those responsible will be held accountable." He paused, scanning the room. "We have reported our findings to the proper authorities and will fully cooperate with their investigation. While this news is difficult, I want to assure our customers and employees that we are committed to rebuilding this institution with integrity and transparency." The reporters erupted with questions, but David maintained his composure, answering each one with honesty and determination. That evening, David sat in his office, feeling the weight of the day's events. Clara entered, holding a newspaper. "You made the front page," she said, setting it on his desk. The headline read, "Bank Owner Exposes Decade-Long Fraud, a Bold Move Towards Redemption." David allowed himself a small smile. "It is a start," he said. But just as he began to feel a glimmer of hope, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "This is David Lawson." A deep voice on the other end replied, "Mr. Lawson, I think we need to talk. I have information about James Bradford's connections that you are going to want to hear." David's heart raced. "Who is this?" The voice hesitated. "Let us just say I used to work for him. Meet me tomorrow at noon. I will send you the location." Before David could respond, the line went dead. He set the phone down, his mind racing. Who was this mysterious caller? And what more could they possibly know? The next day, David waited anxiously at a small, nondescript cafe in the outskirts of the city. The mysterious caller had chosen the location, insisting on privacy. David's instincts told him to bring security, but the caller had warned against it. At exactly noon, a man in a dark trench coat entered. His face was partially obscured by a hat, and he scanned the room cautiously before walking over to David's table. "Mr. Lawson?" he asked quietly. David nodded. "You have information for me?" The man slid into the seat across from him. "My name is Marcus. I was Bradford's personal accountant for 7 years. David's eyes narrowed. "If you worked for him, why are you coming to me now?" Marcus glanced around nervously. "Because I cannot run anymore. Bradford's network is bigger than you think. The missing funds are just the tip of the iceberg." David leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What do you mean? What else is there?" Marcus lowered his voice. Bradford was not just stealing money for himself, he was laundering funds for powerful people, politicians, business moguls, even criminals. They all had a stake in keeping this quiet. That is why you need to be careful. If you dig too deep, they will come after you. David's stomach churned. "Do you have proof of this?" Marcus nodded and pulled out a USB drive from his pocket. "Everything is on here. Transactions, offshore accounts, and the names of everyone involved. But if you are going to use it, you need to do it smart. These people do not play by the rules. David took the drive, his hand shaking slightly. "Why are you giving this to me?" Marcus sighed. "Because I have seen what happens when people like Bradford go unchecked. They ruin lives. And because I want a chance to make things right." That evening, David and Clara examined the contents of the USB drive. As they clicked through the files, the scale of Bradford's corruption became clear. The documents detailed a web of illegal activities, implicating some of the most influential figures in the country. Clara's face was pale. "David, this is dangerous. If this information gets out, it could bring down not just the bank, but entire institutions. People will come after you." David nodded grimly. "I know, but we cannot ignore this. These people need to be held accountable." Clara hesitated. "Then we need a plan. If we are going to expose this, we have to ensure your safety and the safety of everyone involved." David's mind raced. "We will start by notifying the authorities, but we will also leak some of this to trusted journalists. The more people who know the truth, the harder it will be for them to silence us." As they finalized their strategy, a loud bang echoed through the building. Clara jumped, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered. David stood, his heart pounding. "Stay here." He cautiously opened the office door and peered into the hallway. It was empty, but a faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. Suddenly, the fire alarm blared, and Paul Watkins burst into the room, his face pale. "David!" Someone tried to set fire to the records room. David's blood ran cold. "Was anyone hurt?" "No," Paul said, "but this was no accident. Someone is trying to destroy evidence." David clenched his fists. "Then we need to act now. They know we are onto them, and they are getting desperate." As the alarms continued to wail, David realized that the fight was far from over. If Bradford's network was willing to go this far to protect their secrets, what else were they capable of? The fire in the records room was extinguished quickly, but its message was clear. Bradford's network was desperate to silence David. That night, David sat with Clara and Paul, finalizing their plan to release the evidence. "This is it," David said, holding up the USB drive. "Once this goes public, there is no turning back." Clara nodded. "I have reached out to a journalist I trust. She is ready to publish everything, but she needs confirmation that we have more than just allegations." Paul added, "The authorities are expecting our report tomorrow. If we act fast, we can stay one step ahead of whoever is behind this." David sighed. "Then let us move." The following morning, David arrived at the bank, determined to face whatever came next. As he stepped out of his car, he noticed a black SUV idling nearby. He locked eyes with the driver, who quickly looked away. Inside the bank, Paul greeted him with urgent news. "David, Bradford is here. He is demanding a meeting with you." David felt a surge of anger. "Good. It is time he faced me." In the conference room, Bradford was waiting, his expression a mix of arrogance and unease. "You are playing a dangerous game, Lawson," Bradford said as David entered. David closed the door behind him. "The only game being played here is your corruption." "I know everything, James. The missing funds, the laundering, the network of powerful criminals. You are finished." Bradford laughed coldly. "You think you can bring me down? Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? The people I work with will crush you." David stood firm. "Let them try. The evidence is already in the hands of the authorities and the press." "It is over, James." Bradford's confident facade cracked, and his VO ice dropped to a threatening whisper. "If you release that information, it will not just be your career that ends. You are putting yourself and everyone you care about in danger." David leaned in. "Then you had better hope the authorities find you before I do." As the day unfolded, events moved at a breakneck pace. Clara confirmed that the journalist had received the evidence, and Paul reported that the authorities were launching an official investigation. But just as David began to feel a glimmer of hope, a chilling phone call shattered his composure. A distorted voice on the line said, "You were warned, Lawson. Now you will pay the price." The call ended abruptly, and moments later, David's assistant burst into his office. "Sir, security just spotted 2 men tampering with your car in the parking lot." David's heart raced as he bolted for the door. Clara and Paul followed close behind. In the parking lot, security guards had already detained the 2 men. David approached cautiously, his gaze narrowing as he recognized one of them. It was Marcus, the whistleblower. "Marcus," David demanded. "What are you doing here?" Marcus looked panicked. "I swear I was not tampering with your car. I was trying to stop them." David turned to the second man, who remained silent, his face hidden by a cap. Security pulled the cap off, revealing a man David did not recognize. The stranger smirked. "You think you are a hero, Lawson. You have no idea what you are up against." Before David could respond, the man lunged at him, but the guards quickly subdued him. As he was dragged away, he shouted, "This is not over." David turned to Marcus, his expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "You have a lot of explaining to do." Marcus nodded, his hands shaking. "I can explain, but we need to get out of here. You are not safe." Back in the office, Marcus revealed that he had been threatened by Bradford's associates. "They know I gave you the evidence," he said. "They are trying to scare you into silence, but it is more than that. They are planning something big, something that will destroy everything if we do not act fast." David clenched his fists. "Then we have no time to lose. We need to expose every last one of them before they can strike again." As the weight of the situation pressed down on him, David realized that the fight was far from over. Bradford's network was more dangerous than he had ever imagined, and the stakes had never been higher. David sat in his office, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. The threats had escalated, and he knew he was on the brink of a dangerous confrontation. But there was no turning back now. The evidence had been leaked, and the authorities were moving in. All he had to do was stay one step ahead of Bradford's network. Clara entered the room, her face tense. "David, I just spoke to the journalist. The first article is live, but Bradford's people are already making moves. They are trying to discredit everything we've said." David's mind raced. How do they plan to do that? They are leaking false information. They are framing you as the mastermind behind the money laundering scheme. If this gets out, it could ruin everything. David's hands clenched into fists. "They are trying to frame me. That is low. We need to act fast or they will turn the tables on us." Just then, Paul entered, his face grim. "David, you need to see this." They all rushed to the security room, where Paul played a video on the screen. It was footage from the bank's security cameras showing 2 men breaking into the vault the night before. David felt his stomach drop. One of the men was wearing a disguise, but the other, it was Marcus. "This is impossible," Clara whispered. "He was helping us." David's mind raced. Was Marcus playing both sides? Had he been compromised? But the look on Marcus' face when they caught him earlier, he had seemed genuine. Paul turned to David. "I am afraid we have no choice but to confront him. If he is working with Bradford, we are in even more danger than we thought." David nodded slowly. "You are right. We need to find him, and we need to find him now." As the day wore on, David, Clara, and Paul scrambled to track down Marcus. But he had vanished. His phone was off and no one knew where he had gone. David's mind raced. Was Marcus in danger or was he a threat to them? Bradford's network was capable of anything, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. David's phone buzzed, and he picked it up quickly. It was a message from an anonymous number. "You should not have trusted Marcus. He is working with Bradford, but it is not too late to join us. Come to the old warehouse at the docks. Midnight. If you want to make this all go away, you will meet us there. David's heart pounded. This was it, the final showdown. That night they arrived at the warehouse on the docks. The air was thick with tension as they approached the entrance. The place was dimly lit, and the faint smell of salt water lingered in the air. David's breath caught when he saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was Marcus. "Marcus," David called. "What is going on? Why did you betray us?" Marcus stepped forward, his face unreadable. "I did not betray you, David. I was trying to protect you, but I was forced to work with Bradford. If I didn't, my family would have paid the price." David's mind was reeling. "You could have told me. We could have found another way." Marcus shook his head. "You don't understand. This goes far beyond just you and me. This is bigger than anyone." Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the warehouse, and the doors slammed shut behind. "And them?" David spun around, his heart racing. A group of men, heavily armed, emerged from the shadows. "Bradford's people. Looks like you came to the wrong place, Lawson," one of them sneered. David's hand instinctively reached for his phone. "Clara, Paul, get ready. We need to move." But before he could make a move, Marcus raised his hands. "Wait. Don't do anything. They are going to kill us all." The tension in the air was thick, and David knew he had no choice but to play along for now. But he also knew that this was the moment of truth. Either he would walk out of here a free man, or this would be the end of everything. Bradford's men closed in, their eyes cold and calculating. David took a deep breath. "This ends tonight, Bradford." Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the air gun shots. Everything happened in a blur. The men who had surrounded David collapsed, and chaos erupted. A familiar voice shouted from the shadows, "Get down!" It was Paul. He had arrived with backup. The warehouse erupted in gunfire as David and Marcus ducked behind a stack of crates. As the fight raged on, David's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea how this would end, but one thing was certain. He was not going down without a fight. And when the dust settled, the truth would be exposed.